let's take a look at how we actually punctuate the restrictive and the non-restrictive relative clause. I just really butchered that. All right, so following along with your guided note sheet. So a relative clause is defined as either restrictive or non-restrictive. And so you can think of this also as being essential or non-essential. It's the way that I was taught. If you like saying, hey, this is essential or this is non-essential, it's the same thing as like saying it's restrictive or it's non-restrictive. Basically what it means is how important is it to the noun that it modifies. So it has very little to do with the actual clause. It has everything to do with the noun that it's describing. So looking at our notes on restrictive clauses, when we talk about it being restrictive, we're saying that it is essential. Think of it as the noun that it modifies as being so broad that it needs a descriptor to kind of narrow it down because it's too broad of a noun. So therefore, this clause restricts it by specifying the noun a little bit. All right, so those are all things you might want to write down in your notes. Let's take a look at our two example sentences. All right. I want you to note that these guys do not take commas. They're not going to take any commas. I'll show you what I mean. I said the magician who was bound by the chains is Houdini. Well, notice how the noun magician is very broad. There are lots of magicians in the world. So therefore, the question is, which magician is Houdini specifically? So I need anything I can get to help explain which particular magician you're talking about. So therefore, magician is sort of the magician who's bound by chains is the one who's Houdini. So therefore, this adjective clause helps restrict which magician you're talking about because the word magician is so broad. And that is why there are no commas in that first example sentence. Second example reads, I want to figure out the way that Houdini escapes from those ropes. Well, notice how the noun way is too broad. And so we're left sort of like saying, I want to figure out which way. Like that's a very broad sentence. I want to figure out the way. You're like, what do you mean the way? So therefore, I need to explain which way you're talking about. And therefore, I would say, well, it's the way that Houdini escapes from those ropes. I realize that adjective clause is really important to the sentence. Otherwise, the sentence doesn't make a whole lot of sense without it. And that's the reason, once again, that there are no commas. I need to restrict that very broad word of way or the very broad word magician with some extra words to help explain which particular magician, which way are you talking about. Now, underneath there, we have our non-restrictive relative clauses. So they're like saying they're non-essential to the sentence. You don't really need them. And so think of the noun is already pretty specific. It doesn't need any extra descriptors. It doesn't need any extra help. So therefore, adding this relative clause doesn't change the meaning of the noun. He's already doing a pretty good job by himself. So therefore, if I don't need this, it's not essential. And anything that's not essential in the English language, we put commas around because you don't really need it. So non-restrictive or non-essential adjective clauses do take commas. Example, are you going to the traveling circus show, which arrives in town this weekend? Well, think about how the traveling circus show is pretty specific. I can't imagine there being many traveling circus shows in your town at the same weekend. So it's probably very specific if there's just one. So therefore, it's more likely if there's just one traveling circus show in town, you're not really going to need that extra information. It's just sort of unnecessary to that noun. And that's why we add a comma in. Second example says, the human bird, which drew in large crowds, flew nearly 100 yards above us. Well, notice how the human bird is pretty specific. And so therefore, more likely, he's probably the only human bird. And therefore, the relative clause is not really necessary to explain which human bird it is. He's probably the only one. And for that reason, we can put commas in this sentence. You'll notice that I put two commas because this time the adjective clause is in the middle of the sentence. So it's like having an opening parentheses and a closing parentheses. I need both of them. So this time I had to include both commas. Cool. All right. So sometimes it can be either restrictive or non-restrictive. Sometimes you can get away with either one, but it changes the meaning. So if we go back to that worksheet we had yesterday, if I say the magician at Minka's party who pulled the hobbit out of his hat made the guests laugh and cheer, Let's talk about that. Well, if I put commas around that, it could be non-restrictive. Let's consider that there's only one magician at Minka's party. So we wouldn't need to specify which one we're referring to. There's just one magician walking around. So therefore we'd add commas. But if I went with the second sentence, you would be equally correct, but it changes the meaning. When I take the commas out, it kind of implies that there were many magicians at Minka's party. And therefore, we're like, well, which magician are you talking about? Which one made the guests laugh and cheer? Oh, the one that pulled the hobbit out of his hat. It's very similar to how we dealt with on a positive and how it changes the meaning of the sentence, whether we add commas or take those commas out. So really, both of those would be correct. And this is the power of the comma. It changes the meaning of the sentence. So we have to be very intelligent with how we use our commas. All right, we'll pause.